All right. Today, I am absolutely thrilled for you today because today you get to hear from a gentleman that has done almost 1,000 deals in the land investing space. He has his own podcast, RE Tipster. He does self-storage units. This gentleman also is a husband. He's a father, and he also has another podcast called Storyland, where he creates children's stories so that they can have a better, more enjoyable bedtime experience. Please welcome with me Mr. Seth Williams. Thanks for being on the show today.
Thanks, Roger. It's great to be here.
Absolutely. So, Seth, tell us a little bit about yourself. How'd you get to where you are today?
Sure. Yeah, it's a loaded question. I guess the real estate thing, this started back in 2009, I think, is when I first really started getting into the land investing space. But that's when I learned how to find motivated sellers of vacant land. And I would send out mailers and buy them for really cheap and then do nothing to them and sell them for more. And it's kind of morphed into a much bigger business over the years. And eventually I started retipster.com, where I essentially taught people what I knew about that. And that's still going today.
Wow. Yeah. Wow. So let me ask you this. When you first got started, what gave you the thought process to go look for old tax liens? Where'd that come from?
Yeah. So I'd heard about it from another educator. Just this idea, it's almost like a two-part thing. Part one is finding people who are delinquent on their taxes. It's a little bit different from tax liens, but it's a similar concept. You're basically just finding them before the county comes in and takes their property. But not just that, it's going specifically after vacant land properties that were like that. And in doing so, you would find people that have a built-in motivation to sell for a cheap price. And it's also land. So it's not like a house where there's like a deeper emotional connection to it. It's just dirt. And in a lot of cases, the people that own this land, it was kind of just out of sight, out of mind. It wasn't really helping them. It was just like a tax bill they had to pay, and they wanted to be done with it. And I would show up with a big easy button saying, here, I'll just give you cash for this thing that you're already not paying your taxes on. I'll pay your taxes off and I'll buy it. And my price all in would be really cheap. At the time, it's a little bit different today, but back then I could buy properties for like 10 to 30% of market value.
Wow.
And especially when I started, these are pretty small deals. I think my first property ever, I paid $331 for it, and then sold it for $1,900. So like not huge money, but the cool thing was like, these are kind of numbers that almost anybody could do if you really want to, and you don't need a loan for it. Like you can just use the money in your own bank account. And once I did that a handful of times, it was like, wow, this is awesome. Like this isn't really that hard to do. It's just a matter of, knowing where to find the list of people and contacting them and starting the conversation and that kind of thing.
Wow. So let me ask you, if you will you paint the picture for us? Take us back to 2009. The real estate bubble had just popped in 2008. Here you are. Where were you in your professional life, or your personal life? What was going on? Did you have a lot of money to start with? Were you born with a silver spoon in your mouth? Or dad said, hey, here's $100,000, go out and make something happen? Or what was that story that led up to you getting that very first deal done?
Yeah, so that was part of the reason why land was so good for me, is because I didn't have a ton of money. I had like a few $1,000s to my name. And prior to that, I'd been looking at like flipping houses and rental properties and that kind of thing, but I just didn't have the money. And I could have taken out a loan, but in hindsight, I'm glad it didn't work out because I didn't know what I was doing. It was kind of a risky move to do that. But with land, I could get into it with the cash I had in my bank account. And it was a fairly low risk situation because there's only so many things that can go wrong with a piece of land. There's nothing built on it. Like it can't get broken, stolen, or destroyed. It's a pretty dead nut simple thing for the most part. And when you're getting into an asset at a small fraction of what it's really worth, it's just hard to get hurt on that.
Wow.
So yeah, it was really just a question of knowing where to find these people. In the beginning, it was the delinquent tax list from the county. And this is a list that every county in the country has. They won't all give it to you freely, but it's just the list of people that are currently back due on their taxes.
Wow.
And you just ask for that list. Sometimes you'll have to pay for it. And usually it's kind of a mess. It's kind of annoying to work with. But if you can get through that hard part, it's a gold mine of information, because it's a bunch of people that are basically saying, I don't want my property. Because if you did want your property, why wouldn't you pay your taxes?
Right, exactly. So let me ask you this. Let's walk back through that first deal that you started going through. Now, obviously now you're successfully unemployed, you have multiple things going and life's going really great for you. But what did that look like in terms of income? What other things were you doing when you got that first deal done?
You mean like what my job was at the time?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Did you have a job?
Yeah.
Or, at what point in time did investing into land overtake your income? How long did that take? What was that process like? Was this like just some extra money on the side that you didn't think was going to turn into this big monster that it is today? Or is it just like a hobby? What was that? What was your thought process and where were you at when you started?
Yeah. So at the time, I had a job in the banking industry, working for a small business financing company. And it was the type of job that it afforded me some downtime, and also on like the nights and weekends, like there was margin, and I had some disposable time to do this kind of thing. So that was my situation. And it was probably about 2 or 3 years until the income from this part-time pursuit in land overtook the income from my job. The only reason I know that off the top of my head is because there was a deal I did in 2011 that eclipsed the annual income from my job from that one deal.
Wow.
And that was a cool thing. It was just a big light bulb moment because up until then, I just didn't have that much money. So I was going after these really small deals, but it works kind of a similar way as you get into bigger properties. The model changes a little bit in terms of how the conversation looks, that kind of thing that you have with these sellers. But by and large, they take about the same amount of work. It's just a matter of going after properties that have more value to them. And it's kind of just adding a couple zeros to the end of them. And it's a similar kind of thing where you might, instead of buying it for a few $100, you might pay a few thousand or even $10,000. But then the upside is that much bigger on the back end.
So when you did that deal in 2011, did you just say, oh, got this job that eclipsed my income, I quit day one? Or
No.
what that process look like?
Yeah. So, I mean, there was a part of my brain that went there pretty quick, but the thing about the land business is it can be very spiky in nature. Like you'll have a big deal like that. It looks awesome, but that's just one deal. Like you got to keep finding more like that. And you never really know when that next deal is going to come along. If you're consistent with it, like you usually will, but it's not like a totally predictable thing. So I still worked my job for years after that, mainly just from this uncertainty complex of being like, you never know. I don't know if I'm comfortable doing this. And it wasn't until like probably 4 or 5 years later, I think, when I officially pulled the plug on my job and went out on my own. So it's kind of thing where like I could have done it sooner, but the way my brain works is like, I just want certainty with stuff. So I just played it really safe. But I know other people that have not thought that way and they just pull the plug and they're out there. And I guess the benefit of when you finally do leave your job is that you have that much more time to pursue the business.
Absolutely. I think there's so much value in that because, I can speak for myself who I'm currently employed myself and I do very well in my business. Truth be told, I may be able to walk away sooner than I think, but it's that element of having that level of certainty when you have responsibility and you have kids and you have a wife and you have a house and you have responsibility. So, help us understand, how did you shift from that mindset of ensuring certainty through your W-2 to ensuring certainty through your business?
Yeah, that's a great question. So something me and my wife did when I was just kind of at the end of my rope with my job, I'm just like, I just can't do this anymore. Like I want to be free. So we sat down and we put together what we called the apocalypse budget. And we basically just went line by line through every expense we had each month. We're like, okay, is this absolutely necessary to live? Like, do we really need this Netflix subscription or this expensive cell phone plan or going out to eat? We realized that we could actually live very, very cheaply if we really wanted to. And it was kind of like a big light bulb moment. Like, I could have left this thing a long time ago. But it's amazing how much dumb stuff we all pay for every month. It's totally unnecessary. And it keeps us a slave to our job because I don't know if we think we need this stuff or what, but if you're willing to trim some of this stuff, I mean, you can leave your job way sooner than you really think. If you really tighten the belt and even, I mean, say if you've got an expensive house payment or something, it's like, move, you got an extra car, like get rid of it. The first, I think it was like 2 or 3 years after I quit my job, we had one car. And it's not that we couldn't have had 2 cars, but it was just like, I'm working at home all day, every day. Like we just don't need this car. And we were surprised to find there were very few situations when we truly needed to have 2 cars and be at 2 separate places at the same time. We just, knowing we had one car, we could just plan around it and just figure out our schedules. And it's one of those things when you kind of know your goal is to live cheaply, you can find ways to structure your life around that, which ultimately lets you leave your job sooner and ultimately makes you wealthy a lot faster because now you can use that time to plow into your money-making pursuits that you previously only had a part-time, calendar to work with.
Wow. That's so encouraging.
Yeah.
So then let me ask you this with that same thought process in mind, right? You said you had first started in 2009. You got that first really big deal in 2011 and you left your job in 2015. At the time of this recording, we're almost a decade away from that or just approaching that decade away from that. So let me ask you this. Looking in hindsight, if you could go back to 2011, if you can go back to 2009, for the cost of your freedom, the freedom that you enjoy now, the travel freedom, the family freedom, the time to do whatever you want, do you think that you would have went back and did something different in 2009 or in 2011 in order to move that date up quicker? Or what do you think that you would have changed either in your mindset or your activity process to be able to get you there sooner?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, man, there's just so much more I know now that I didn't know back then. And that's probably true for anybody who's been in my situation, whatever their business is. You just learn a lot in the course of doing stuff. But yeah, I would have just doubled and tripled down on everything. Another interesting development that's happened over the years since I started is there's a lot more land investors out there now. It used to be literally a zero competition business. That's not true at all anymore. There's plenty of competition out there, still plenty of opportunity, but like it takes more mail now to find deals. And especially in this current market we're in, it's pretty hard to get deals for 10 to 30% of market value. You just have to offer more to get these things accepted. So knowing what I know now, like if I could go back then, like I guess another thing I know now is there's a lot of creative ways to get money for these deals. Whereas back then I didn't know about any of this. I thought I was limited to the cash that I had in my bank account. That's it. But there's so much money out there for a good land deal if you just know where these funders are. So man, I would have gone after much bigger deals a lot faster. I would have utilized these funding sources. Also like subdividing, that's something that for most land flippers 10 years ago, it really wasn't on anybody's radar. Like nobody was doing that. And now it's a very common thing. And you can make a lot more money that way.
Wow.
So yeah, and I could go on and on. There's tons of stuff I would do differently. But I guess a big lesson I've learned is like, if you ever find something that like works and it makes money, just realize like it might not always work. In fact, at some point, it probably won't work anymore to some degree, or at least the model's going to change in some way. So like if you find something that's super profitable, like double down, because like you just don't know when someone's going to pull the rug out from under you, and it's going to be kind of different now. And it usually doesn't happen that quick. Usually it happens over the course of years, but just seeing the things that are more challenging now that weren't very hard back then, like, man, I could have made a lot more money a lot faster.
Wow. Now I love that. So, what that brings me to is, when I had first met you in person here a few days ago, because we're out at this wonderful conference here. And when I first met you, you're kind of dressed like the way you are now, very unassuming, it wouldn't look like you've done over 1,000 deals. It's very nice, very laid back, very easygoing. So, with that type of persona, right, how would you suggest that someone who's brand new to the industry, right, would you suggest that they just kind of talk to anyone, or would you suggest that they go to a specific website? Is there a way that you could teach them, or do you teach them? Do you help people with this? Because, what I'm really getting at with this question is that, I had no idea, right, who you were, what you did. And I was just wowed in talking to you, just wowed in the information and the abundance of information. So you'd mentioned going back and getting education. How would you have known to go find someone in the land investing space, or how would you have known where to find them? And if you know what you know now, like you said that you can help people, but how would you have done that differently to find that education, or even get these people's help?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. So some things were easier back when I started. Some things were also a lot harder, like just availability of information. There just wasn't that information out of back then. There's a lot more of that information out there today. It's actually been one of the things that I've spent thousands of hours putting into retipster.com, is by just trying to give this education to people for free. Really, there's a handful of paid things I've got available, but like for the most part, you can get a lot of stuff for free on retipster.com. There's one blog post I've got. You can find that at landflippinglifecycle.com. And it's basically it's almost like a little mini course in a blog post with links to a lot of other stuff on the blog that kind of teach how this model works and how you can get started. I do have a full-blown course at landinvestingmasterclass.com. That's like a super deep dive on everything you need to know. But yeah, to this day, every week, I spend tons of time making new videos and trying to update people on like how things are changing, how stuff works today, different tools that are available now that weren't available back when I started. There's a lot to know about it, but ultimately the model is fairly simple, but it still takes a fair amount of work to implement it. And there's a little bit of, psychological challenge to it, because there's this element of uncertainty where like some deals are $100,000 and you go in on it and just like, man, I sure hope I'm right about the value of this thing. And if you just kind of follow in the right process, like you probably are right, but it's still kind of scary when you have a deal that big and you're putting that much money on the line. So I think the most successful people I've seen in the land business is they're able to deal with that a lot better. Like they don't let that slow them down or they're able to kind of look to the fundamentals and just understand, like, I'm doing it the way you're supposed to do it, so it's probably going to work. And they just sort of fearlessly move forward. And that's something like even today, I kind of have a hard time with. Like every time I'm looking at a huge deal, it's just like, oh gosh, this better work out. Whereas a lot of other people I know, like they just don't think that way. They're like, yep, it's going to be fine. Just do it. So it's a tricky balance between being somewhat cavalier, but not too cavalier. Like you want to have the right mixture of conservativeness, but also being liberal enough to just know when to run after things.
Absolutely. And, here's what I know. Success leaves footprints. And the first time I was introduced to you was actually hearing you talk to our good friend, Dustin Heiner, who is the host of Master Passive Income, that podcast. And, I heard your voice. I was like, oh, wow, this guy sounds really sharp. But when I met you a few days ago, it took me a while to connect the dots because, you're just this humble, easygoing guy. It's almost difficult to get you to talk about your success.
Sure.
So, the reason why I say success leaves footprints is because if I was going down an endeavor like this, I would want to have access to someone like you that could be able to guide me step by step to walk me through this process. So do you do any one-on-one coaching or any mentoring of anyone of that sort?
I have in the past. It's not something I go out of my way to pursue these days. I mean, if it was the right situation, I suppose I would. But there's a couple coaches that I work with that they do this all day long. Like they're in the coaching business. So usually what I'll do is I'll refer people to them. And depending on where a land investor is at, they can kind of go with the one that makes the most sense. If you go to retipster.com/coaching, you can find those people. But yeah, I've done coaching from time to time, usually in a group format.
Wow.
Thing.
Wow, that is so awesome.
Yeah.
I love how you're just constantly delivering value. Hey, retipster.com, go get the free resources. retipster.com, go get the courses, go get the information. And that leads me into the next podcast that you have, Storyland.
Yeah.
Tell us about that. How did that come about?
Totally different. Nothing to do with real estate. It's just, the Storyland podcast is something I started doing back in 2021, I think, where every night before bed, I would just make up stories just on the spot for my kids. And I would notice that they would be like captivated by these stories. And I would end them on like a cliffhanger and they would just be like begging to know the next part. And I was like, there must be something to this. Like if they really like this, maybe other kids would like this. So I have access to these sound effects in music libraries. And I went back and I sort of retold these stories and put sound effects and music to them and put them in a podcast format because I kind of knew how to do this stuff anyway. And for like a year, each episode would get like 8 downloads. Like me and my one friend and their kids would download, like whatever. But then out of the blue, like a year later, I started getting these emails from Buzzsprout that hosts the podcast. And like every day, be like, you just got 500 more downloads today. And the next day, you just got 500 more downloads. I'm just like, what? That's weird. I thought it was some kind of mistake. But after keep seeing like all of a sudden these milestones that hit, boom, boom, I'm like, why is it getting so many downloads? And I started trying to figure it out. I was searching on the internet for my podcast to see, like, did some famous person mention this or something? This is weird. And I went to Apple Podcasts in the kids and family category, and it was number 21 in the world. And I was just like, what? And it was this amazing moment of validation because, like, I never told anybody about this. Just by itself, it kind of blew up. I still don't really understand what happened, but yeah, interestingly, it gets way, way, way more downloads than the RE Tipster podcast does because it's a totally different audience. It doesn't really make any money at this point, but it's just really cool to have this creative hobby that, like, legitimately thousands of kids all over the world enjoy it. It's just super fulfilling to be part of that. So
wow, that is so awesome.
Yeah.
I just love how you just are continually delivering value, doing these things where it's not even making you a lot of money, but you're just giving to the world. You're contributing to other children's bedtimes. And, as a father myself, as someone who has 4 kids, right? Story time is a really important thing. And I'm sure it's important for, the people that's out there. I'm sure it's important for the listener to be able to have a good source of good quality, wholesome kid stories at nighttime. And I just love how you're adding so much value to the marketplace, so much value to other parents by putting this out there. So I think it's so cool that you're doing that. And I want to thank you for doing that. Seth, I had a couple more questions for you because, I think I would be remiss without asking you some of these really integral things that, through all the success that you've had with Storyland, through all the success that you've had with RE Tipster, through all the success that you've had in all of your business endeavors, let me ask you, how has failure shaped your life?
Yeah, man, that's probably the most important thing. I mean, that's where lessons are learned. And when it's all going fine, there's not a lot of lessons that come out of that. At least I feel like there's not. Yeah, I mean, whether it's a bad deal or, picking a partner that doesn't work out or any of that stuff, you can always sort of look back at the situation and realize different red flags you should have noticed back then. And as long as you're paying attention to that, you can then notice those red flags going forward and just get a lot smarter. The next time a partnership opportunity comes up or a deal or something like that, you know the landmines to watch out for. And I see people all the time who are just getting started in this and like they don't see that stuff because they just don't know. They don't have the benefit of experience and they're not, or sometimes like it's even told to them, but they haven't felt that pain of a bad deal yet. So like that's when you really learn and you don't forget it, is when you have that tough experience. So I mean, I guess you could call it failure, you could call it lessons learned, but it's a super important part. And
Wow, that's awesome. Thank you so much for that. Yeah, one more question for you here. Let me ask you, for all of our listeners out there, in the spirit of education, what do you think a good resource would be in terms of books or another piece of media that you would suggest that someone consumes to help them get along in their journey if they would so choose to invest in land or to pursue any business venture?
Yeah. Well, let's see. So for land specifically, my friend Travis King, he's actually got like the best book I've seen on land investing. It's called what's it called again? The Land Investor's Playbook, I think is what it's called. But he just beautifully lays out lots of I think it's 7 different plays in the playbook, but it's basically 7 different ways that you can do a land deal, essentially. And when you look at it, there's basically almost 7 different business models to follow. And it's just good to be aware of that stuff. Different ways you could take down a deal, or if a deal doesn't quite fit this cookie cutter approach, you can pivot and do it this way. But Travis has an awesome book on that. In terms of just like general life business stuff, so there's a book I really like. It's called Necessary Endings by Henry Cloud. And I actually haven't read it in a while, but I read it probably like 10 years ago and it really made a big impact on me at the time. Is this idea of as life gets busier, as life gets more full, as your business grows, as a relationship grows, there's certain things that must be pruned. Like you can't just let it all get unwieldy and out of control. Like certain things have to be cut in order for your life to stay healthy, and understanding like that's not a bad thing. Like, in fact, it's a required thing in order to live a healthy life. And I think a lot of us kind of forget that. It's more just like, let me take on as much as I possibly can. But the sooner you can realize, not only is it not bad, but it's appropriate to cut stuff out of my life, it just makes it easier to do that and easier to live a healthier life, really.
Wow. As a man of faith, that speaks to me heavily. Jesus actually said in the Bible that any tree that doesn't produce fruit will be cut. And, he even told that fig tree that didn't produce any fruit to die. And I think that's so true in our lives, right? Those things that are not adding value, those things that are not serving, those relationships, while they may be good, how do they help us on the pathway for the rest of our lives? How do they add impact? And I really appreciate you making that reference by Mr. Henry Cloud. I believe you said Necessary Endings?
Yep, Necessary
I'm going to pick up that book and I'm going to read it. I promise you that. Wow. Seth, tell the audience, last question, where can they find you if they want to get in contact with you? This has just been awesome.
Yeah, sure. So retipster.com. RE is in real estate, or if you're on any social platform, just look for RE Tipster, and that's how you can find me.
Wow. Seth, thanks so much for being on the show. Really appreciate it.
You bet. Thanks, Roger.
Absolutely.